We're going to be talking about variegated threads. And I've got to just get used to where my hands are here, so I've got it in the right spot for you. I think we're in good shape. There are different brands and different types of variegated thread. I'm going to talk about some of the features of the thread, and then I'm going to show you some stitch outs with variegated thread. So first off, as far as different types, obviously there are different brands, but each different brand makes their variegated thread a little bit differently. You will hear about a brand called Sulky and what they call their blendables. And what blendables are is they are a variegated thread that has an uneven amount of variegation. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'm going to stretch this thread out. This one's a little hard to see, but you'll see it's almost white here. It goes to light pink, and as I pull it across, you'll see a section of white, and then a real short little section right in here of pink, and then some white, and then a longer section of pink. It's all different as you go across the thread. You'll get wider and shorter distances of color, which means that it isn't exactly the same, which would be an even variegated. We'll talk about that in a minute, excuse me. The advantage of a varied or a blendable thread is that if you do a satin stitch, it doesn't look like a stripe. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in a minute. But this one, as you look across the thread, it is all different widths of color. And each of these spools closes a little bit differently. They all have some type of a way to catch your thread tails. This one, the end just pops up. You lay your thread in that track and snap it closed. And that way your thread doesn't unwind. And that is Sulky blendable. This next one is a Floriani variegated thread. The cap snaps off the end and the thread comes out. So when I finish, I just lay this across and snap the cap back on, and that keeps the thread in place. If it doesn't go on, I've had people say, oh, it doesn't work. If you put it on the other way, it won't stick. It's like putting a Tupperware lid on upside down. When you stitch, you always want to put that ring back on there. But now I'm going to pull this out, and you can see as I come across, the thread has different longer and narrower sections of pink, but these are longer sections. You can see I've got a section of white here that's probably 8 or 9 inches, where on the blendable, my longest section was just a few inches. So here I've got a fair bit of white, and then I'm going to go into, here comes the dark pink, and it's a fairly long section of that. And so this gives me a longer stitch area of the same color, as opposed to the blendables, where there are a lot shorter sections of color. And then the third one I'm going to show you, this is by Isacord, and they have a little snap. The end here just kind of pries open. You close it and open it, lay your thread into that track when you're done, and that keeps your thread from unwinding. But this one, you'll see the coloring is very short. Purple, green, blue, purple, green, blue, purple, green, blue. Same order, same length of thread. The green is longer, then there's a little shorter blue. The blue and purple are about the same size. Then the longer green, blue, purple, longer green. So although it's variegated, there is a pattern to the variegation. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. Now I'm going to show you what difference that makes. So here is the first stitching with the blendable thread, and I'm going to grab that again. This was the blendable that had a little shorter variegation, and it went from pink to light pink to medium pink, and it was varied. So when you look at that stitching, I'm going to go up real close here, you can see when I stitch a satin stitch, it almost looks like stripes, but the stripes are different widths based on how long the section of thread was. So that's what a satin stitch looks like with a blendable. There's a feather stitch, and again you'll see some that are white, some that are different shades of pink. And then this one was a decorative stitch, And you can see in that same revolution of one stitch, you have multiple colors of pink in there in different places. This next one is, the isocord. This is the one that was even with the blue and purple. So here in the satin stitch, you can see that blue, purple, looks like stripes, and they're evenly spaced. When you look at the feather stitch, you have about the same number of stitches in blue and purple, and then a little longer green, just like the thread. It was blue, purple, green, with the green being a little longer. And here you get a more confetti type look with those bigger stitches. Again, multiple colors in that same stitch. And then the last was the Floriani, and that's where they had longer sections of color. And so you can see how on that satin stitch, on the satin stitch, there are longer spaces of color compared to the shorter ones in both the other threads. So the Floriani gives you a longer color, longer variation of color. And you can see how that stitches. You get a lot more stitches in a row of the same color, and then it moves to another color. So on this swirl stitch, you'll see here I have almost a whole pink, and then almost a whole white, and then a half of a pink, and that is the difference in how wide, how far apart the variegation is on the thread. So that gives you that different look. I'll see if I can get all three on the screen at the same time. I'm going to put that up just a little bit. I think I did them a little too far apart, but I'll just show them to you one more time. They have a different look, but they're all interesting. So what does that mean to you that those variegations are different and they stitch differently? They mean your end project is going to come out differently depending on which thread you use. And so you want to think about what you're doing. If I'm doing a satin stitch, remember that this is going to look like a stripe. If I picked this thread in like shades of red and white, it would stitch a really cute candy cane. But if I wanted to outline a flower, I might not want it to look striped. So you kind of plan what you're doing, and I always test a section, so at least an inch or two with a decorative stitch with variegated thread so that you know what it looks like. The running stitch, it's hard to tell. You can see as I move across, that actually was, that length in the Floriani thread was almost all one color. In the isocord thread, even on the running stitch, I get multiple colors. And on the blendable, I also get multiple colors. And I'm sorry about that fuzz, but on this fabric, where I'm standing, I hardly see that. The camera is doing a wonderful job of magnification. So now I'm going to show you some projects that are stitched out with variegated thread so that you can get a feel for it. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about one more thing first. I'm going to talk about feet. You can use any feet that you want on your machine, whatever you'd use for your regular stitch. But my favorite to use when I'm doing a satin stitch is thick and it can get caught up on the bottom of the foot and kind of cause a little bit of drag. So my J foot is perfectly flat on the bottom. It's got a little bit of a ridge right here, but this bottom piece is all flat, which means that satin stitch, as I go over it, the foot is going to kind of be riding over that satin stitch, and it may not flow as smoothly as I'd like. If you look at my end foot on the bottom, the two sides are actually raised, here and here, almost like a pair of skis with a space in between. What that does is the feed dogs ride on these two tracks, and the decorative stitch, the satin stitch, flows in between. So there's no pressure on that satin stitch while you're sewing along. You'll get a much smoother finished look by using a foot that's raised in the middle when you're stitching a satin stitch. Again, that's whether you use variegated thread or not. And with variegated thread, I usually just use pre-wound bobbin. I don't use variegated on the bobbin unless I'm quilting a quilt and I want the back to look the same as the front. But often I've got a variegated that I would choose for the front, and then I'll just put a solid on the back. Often my backs are solid, and I don't necessarily need a variegated on the back. Variegateds are a little bit more expensive, so doing just a plain on the back works fine based on what your fabric is. All right, and now I'm going to just show you, I'm going to set this out of the way, and I'm going to show you some samples of things that were stitched with variegated threads. Some of them are embroideries, but remember, on a sewing machine it's going to stitch the exact same way. You might have to do it free motion on your sewing machine, but this was a little design that was from OESD, their scrollwork alphabet, and this is two different stitch colors. The dark purple is all one color, and these small swirls out each side were one color, but these swirls and curls in the middle, I put in a green variegated thread. And so those swirls all change colors. And they just look really interesting with the letters. And I'm going to just show you a couple here. They're pretty similar. But I just spelled out my last name. These are going to turn into a pillow. But I liked the way that those scrolls changed. Would help if I held it upside right. I liked the way the scrolls changed in the letters. It just gave it a really interesting look. To my eye, much more interesting than just using a solid thread. So variegateds will play nicely for you. This was also an embroidery, but again, if you were just doing this free motion and doing some thread painting, all of these little tendrils in here look like they're all different colors. They were actually done with this variegated thread. And so they automatically changed colors, and it looks really nice and artsy with you being able to just concentrate on your stitching and not have to think about what's the balance of my thread, what am I putting where. So a variegated thread looks really neat in that type of a project. Where a variegated thread doesn't look great sometimes, on this one we did just a solid thread around the outside, and it looks pretty. And I was teaching a class on this, and we were talking about variegated thread, and where I did put variegated thread is in the center of the flower. That was all one thread, and it just gave the inside of the flower a beautiful look. I decided not to put it around the outside because, again, remember, if you're doing a satin stitch, the stitch will almost look like a stripe. So this is the one that we did, and then I asked the ladies, all ladies in that class, that if they would share their things they didn't like quite as much. This is one where she picked a variegated thread, and she had it offset a little bit, so she had to redo it because the spacing wasn't right. But she also didn't care for the way the stitching came out. If you look around the petals of the flower and around the petal of the leaves, they all look striped. And it was just too much with her choice of fabric. So remember to test your thread with the design that you're doing. And then the next of these are some samples of what a stitch looks like if you do an embroidery fill, or if you're doing thread painting and you're filling a whole design. This actually, I'm going to hold it up real close, is an embossed texture that was done on the embroidery machine. You can do a similar thing just sewing back and forth with your sewing machine, but you see how this came out looking almost like stripes. That's all one variegated thread, same thread, just stitching back and forth. So it gives you kind of a striped look. It wasn't my favorite when I did that leaf, but it was an interesting way to see what it looked like. The next fill on the same leaf was done with a different variegated thread, and this was a cross stitch design. And a lot of the sewing machines have small cross stitch designs. They might stitch 4 or 5 stitches wide, and you can use them for different things. This is what it looked like with a variegated thread. That spacing is just wherever the thread falls. So kind of an interesting look. I liked that one better than the stripe. It wasn't bad. Kind of looks like camouflage. But it was an interesting effect. I wanted to see what it would look like. The next one shows you again how it makes it look like a stripe. This was done with a brown Floriani variegated, and the outline of that leaf, you can see the variegation was white, tan, brown, tan, white, and it kept going. So I have that even spacing. You'll see that white in an even space all the way around the leaf. And then this last one was also a stripe, a variegated that looked like a stripe around the outside of the leaves. So it's interesting the way variegated thread works. Lots of different options to use for variegated thread, and just kind of a fun process.